All right. Here we are. Is anybody here with me? Not yet. Not on Twitch, at least. How about in here? Can you see these participants? Nope, just me. Okay, cool. All right. Well, I am just gonna quote unquote blast off, as Hassan likes to say. And yeah, then I'll get started. All right. Anybody out there? All right. Well, I suppose that I will just go ahead and get started. I'm going to be watching a video from a talk that Dr. Gabor Maté gave. This was a couple of years ago. I first saw this early in 2023, and the moment I saw it, I knew that Dr. Maté was officially one of my heroes. And his work has really inspired me to go down this path of becoming a clinical social worker and therapist, because I've struggled with addiction, struggled with trauma, and he makes these connections in here. And I really feel like there's just a lot of stuff he says that's maybe runs counter to the current system, like of mental health and the medical system. But I mean, he's just a genius. So without any further ado, let's get started.
It's very simple. I mean, if you look at your own addictions, those of you, and most of you raised your hand, and when you gave it up for a while and then you relapsed, what usually happened that caused the relapse? Usually something stressful happened. So it was your way of dealing with stress. So it follows that the more you stress people, the more you entrench them in their addictions. So create a system that ostracizes and punishes and torments people and exiles them from society. You're just making sure that they're going to stay addicted, that's all. Can I make something clear right away?
Yes.
I just need to correct a couple of things.
I'm live on YouTube. Oh, okay. Oh, thank you.
I forgot you were doing that.
Yeah.
I didn't specialize in neurology and psychology and psychiatry. I wouldn't know very much if I did. I was a family physician, worked in addictions and all kinds of other fields, but that bio seems to be taken off Wikipedia, and I don't know who put it on there, but the second thing is I'm not doing burpees. Earlier,
let's do some burpees.
3 months ago, I decided to do 36,500 push-ups a year. That's 100 a day. And as a result, on December the 4th, when my speaking events are over for the year, I'll be having hernia surgery. So no burpees.
All right, awesome. Well, first off, it's great to have you here. And like I'd mentioned, you weren't in the room when I first said it, this is the first time I've ever brought someone like you and talk about this subject at a business conference like this. And the reason I did it is because some people may not see the relevancy, but I want us to be able to describe to them what it is. And there's much that I can ask you about. I do want to cover.
Well, let's show them the relevancy.
Okay, what is addiction? Let's define it.
So addiction is complex, but it's manifested in any behavior that a person finds temporary pleasure or relief in, and therefore craves, but suffers negative consequences in the long term and can't give up.
So I think that part is important, right? Because, and for a long time, the definition of addiction has included negative consequences. So, that's a little bit different from using, but again, I really do think the focus is on negative consequences. So let's keep going.
Now notice any behavior. I didn't say drugs. Most of the time we think about addiction, we think of substances, and that certainly is one important target of addictive behavior. But I said any behavior. That could be gambling, could be sex, could be relationships, could be internet, could be Facebook, could be shopping, as in my case, could be eating, could be work. Any behavior that gives you temporary relief, pleasure, but you suffer negative consequences and you don't get up, that's an addiction. Now let me ask you this question. According to that definition, how many people here will acknowledge that sometime or another in your lives you've had some kind of an addiction? Sometime. Okay, that's how relevant it is. Mm-hmm. Okay, and if I'm going with that stream, let me also ask you guys another question, for which I'll ask some of you to just put your hand up and shout out your answers. I'm going to ask you not what you were addicted to or when or for how long. I'm just going to ask you, what did you like about it? What did it do for you? What did it give you in the short term? So who would tell?
For me, I know that alcohol, nicotine, marijuana, some other drugs. I forgot what the question was, but yeah, it did offer some relief and escape, right? I think most of my life I felt trapped. So for me, it offered an escape from this world. And, it was definitely a crutch I used for a long time.
Relief from? Pain. Relief from pain. Thank you. Anybody else? Sorry?
Control.
Control gave you, relief from pain gave you control. What else? Love, escape. Somebody said? Escape from? Anxiety. Thank you. What else?
Was that loneliness?
It dealt with loneliness. Okay, let's look at these things now. Escape from pain. Pain relief. Sense of control. Relief from loneliness. What else did people say?
Anxiety.
Relief from anxiety. In other words, inner peace. So right away when you understand that, you get that the addiction wasn't your problem. Your addiction was your attempt to solve the problem.
Right. The problem being our lack of inner peace. And yeah, that's what has to be fixed, right? You can go to treatment, go to rehab, swear you're going to quit, do AA, but if you aren't healing the wounds, right, the deepest wounds, the ones that you probably even deny that are actually wounds, until you heal those, right, you're going to slip back into this negative form, this addiction, this negative use of substances and escapes.
And the real question is, how did that problem develop? How come it's 7 billion human beings in the world you felt lonely? How come you lacked a sense of agency, control, authority in your life? Why were you in so much emotional pain? And everything you've said, the loneliness, the lack of power, the lack of control, the anxiety, these are forms of emotional pain. So my mantra on addiction is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And this is where we can talk more about it, but as you and I both know, the current model of addiction is either the legal one, which says it's a choice that people make and therefore we have to punish them for it, or it's a medical one, in which case it's an inherited brain disease. But it isn't either of those things. What it actually is an attempt to solve a human life problem, that of emotional pain, loneliness, distress, anxiety, whatever it is. And the real question then is, what happened in my life, or your life, Joe, or everybody else's lives here, that we incurred pain. And then how do we deal with our pain? Because the addiction itself magnifies the pain, it multiplies it, it increases it exponentially. So it begins in pain, as Eckhart Tolle, the spiritual teacher, says, addictions begin in pain and they end in pain. Both my addictions, the work was very respectable. It got me nothing but praise and income. And it...
So right here, he's going to start talking about his addictions. You know, this world-renowned physician, yeah, he had addictions, and it's a work and shopping, like he mentioned earlier. And it, for someone who only ever thinks about addiction from the standpoint of drugs and alcohol, or possibly eating, maybe sex, right? They maybe don't make that connection. And so he does a wonderful job here of kind of talking about what he has going on.
Created deep problems in my my family, you know. And then my shopping addiction, well, he's a lover of classical music. Isn't that wonderful? You know. But some of the respectable addictions, and I say this somewhat hesitatingly, but I'll say it anyway in front of a business audience, had to do with profit and power, where for some people, nothing is ever enough. And it's not, and it's not because they're bad people, but because they're trying to stuff a hole inside themselves. And then that can cause serious damage in the world, such as we're seeing with the environment and climate change and other pollution and other issues. You know, so these or in addiction to power, like I'm just reading a biography of Napoleon. And Napoleon was a genius. He really, like, when you talk about genius, that was a genius for you in so many ways. But he was also totally addicted to power. And even in exile, he said, I love power. And he called power his mistress. Well, a lot of people died because of addiction to power. And yet, you know, he's a hero, he's respected. Whereas the substance addict who shoots up heroin in the back alley is ostracized and discarded from society. So, yeah, there's the respectable addictions, and then there's these arbitrarily chosen addicts on whom we project all our disdain and all our self-judgment, basically. The stuff we don't like about themselves, we project it onto these other people.
Well, it was on this stage last year that I actually, for the first time, publicly told about not only my drug addiction, which I, you know, for several years ago was the first time I started talking about being a drug addict.
And what was that in your case? Cocaine, was it? Or what?
It was cocaine, yeah. Right. Well, I mean, heck, when I was between the ages of 16 and 18, it started with, I would get high every day and smoke pot. I would take pills, speed. I would snort crystal meth. I would snort cocaine. And there was one day I remember where one day I was freebasing. I was on LSD, I was smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, taking mushrooms, and snorting crystal meth, all in one day. And
been there.
Okay.
I mean, like, I was in bad shape. And now, Gabor, when I was in Vancouver, you toured me around where you actually, Vancouver's East Side, because you treated some of the worst addicts on Vancouver's East Side for many years. And during that time, you know, I did a lot of drugs, and then I moved away from the environment, started exercising, ended up getting a job in a mental hospital as a mental health tech, and I would take the patients that were there for addiction to AA. I would drive them to AA meetings and NA meetings, and I would sit in on those meetings, never realizing later in life how much relevance it had. But the core addiction was sexual addiction, because I was molested as a kid. My mother died when I was 4. I was molested as a kid. I was paid money not to say anything between the ages of 8 to 10, and it wired in my head that sex is not an intimate act of love and oneness. It's something you do to get off.
If I may interrupt, there was something else here too. So I'll talk about myself and I'll talk about you.
Mm-hmm.
So one of my addictions has been to work. In fact, that's a continued challenge for me, if you look at my travel schedule. So I got a certain message from the world. I was born in Budapest, Hungary, 1944. Jewish parents, 2 months before the Nazis occupy Hungary. So I spent the first year of my life with my mother under Nazi rule, and she was in terror the whole year, as you can imagine. Parents killed in Auschwitz and so on. My father was away in...
I think that it was this story about his life that kind of really made it click for me and my change on thinking about addiction. It just made so much sense, right? I'm not sure in this video, maybe another one, but he argues kind of against this notion of genetic inheritance. There's probably some of that, I think he says, but mostly all of this is based on our traumas. Definitely in another speech, he talks about children who are loved and supported and protected in their formative years, probably I think he's talking anywhere from 8 to 12. They're not going to have the same responses to traumatic events as someone who has unresolved childhood trauma. And possibly even resolved childhood trauma. You might still be traumatized a little bit more easily as an adult.
Labor. The message I got from the world is that the world didn't want me. Not because Hitler didn't want me, because I didn't know Hitler. But my mother was unhappy. And children are narcissists in the developmental sense. They take everything personally. So when the bad things are happening, it must be about me. And if she's not happy around me, Thich Nhat Hanh, the spiritual teacher, says that the greatest gift parents can give their children is their own happiness. Because the children take that personally. It's about us. We must be great creatures. So when my mother is unhappy and depressed and in terror, I get the message the world doesn't want me. And then at 1 year of age, she gives me to a stranger to save my life. So I don't see her for a month. I get the message the world doesn't want me. Now, then in Canada, 30 years later, 30-odd years later, I become a physician. Well, one way to deal with not being wanted is to become a doctor. Because now they're going to want you all the time. They're going to want you when they're being born, they want you when they're dying, and they're going to want you at every moment in between. And the beeper is always going. This is before cell phones, of course. And the beeper is always going, and you're getting validation every moment. And what it is a compensation for the sense of not being wanted that I've never dealt with. Now, in your case, you got a message as well, that you're wanted through your body. You're wanted through your body. You're wanted when you're sexually available. That's the message you get. What are you going to do? So, especially if you look at men who are sex addicts and women who are sex addicts, there's no such thing as a what's the word, an nymphomaniac. That's just a slander. What it really is women, or sometimes men, who've learned that only through their bodies and only through the sexual act are they actually wanted. Well, that's really addictive, because we all need to be wanted. Yeah. And I think that's also what's behind it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, and I lived with so much shame. Even though I started making money, I always had that deep shame and that secret life, and I just struggled. And the thing that became more apparent to me was I was in I became financially capable of joining like a high-profile group, and I joined a high-profile group for people that were struggling with sexual addictions. And in that room were billionaires, famous athletes, politicians, Academy Award-winning actors and actresses, men and women, and I saw people that the world admired in their most broken states, and I realized, wow, that whole saying, that which is most private is most public, that so many people struggle with this, and that's why I've now wanted to use the platform that I have in business to go out and try to change the global conversation about how people view and treat addicts with compassion instead of judgment. And right now the criminal justice system is treating addicts when it needs to be something else.
don't remember how deep they go into this, but yes, prison is not the place for addicts. Prison isn't the place for anyone. I'm a prison abolitionist. I don't believe they should exist, at least not in the form we see them now. But yeah, like so many people agree that their drug head cousin or something should, be locked up for their own good, and it's just not the place. They don't detox you correctly. The risk for suicide is super high. It's already high for just people going in there. So have them addicted to substances, it goes up a little bit. But yeah, I agree totally. Like, it just has to be a whole paradigm shift with how it's treated.
If you look at the criminal justice system, it's really based on this idea that, as I said earlier, that addiction is a choice that somebody makes. If somebody's not making a conscious choice, what are you doing punishing them? Yeah. You don't punish people because they're suffering and they're trying to escape from their pain. You help them,
right?
Instead of making them criminals. And number one. Number two, it's very arbitrary as to what we decide should be legal or illegal, because give me 1,000 heroin addicts who inject 4 times a day in a quantity that does not lead to an overdose, and give me 1,000 people who smoke a pack a day, and another 1,000 who drink heavily. Guess which 1,000 is going to be the healthiest and the longest living at the end of 30 years? By far the heroin group. So by far, I'm talking medical facts here. So by some, I'm not saying that heroin should be legalized and sold in corner stores like cigarettes, but I am saying that the decision to criminalize it is utterly arbitrary, and has nothing to do with either science or logic or humanity.
I mean, you just look at the opiate addiction. We need voices, we need people of influence that could share something that is helpful, because you cannot punish pain out of people in the criminal justice system. And you said in one of your talks that if you wanted to create the perfect system that would keep people addicted, you would create the exact prison system that we have in the United States. And it's true.
It's very simple. I mean, if you look at your own addictions, those of you, and most of you raised your hand, and when you gave it up for a while and then you relapsed, what usually happened that caused the relapse? Usually something stressful happened. So it was your way of dealing with stress. So it follows that the more you stress people, the more you entrench them in their addictions.
Right. So you send someone against their will to jail. You charge them with multiple crimes, some of them misdemeanors, some of them felonies, right? They carry fines and jail time. And if you're going in there addicted to something, and especially if your imprisonment is due to drug use or substance use, yeah, the first thing you're going to do when you get out, I know this for a fact because it's happened every time I give them health care. We don't educate them. We don't make sure that they have the ability to live trauma-free childhoods. We don't make sure that parents of children can live stressless lives, right? And to ensure that we're not perpetuating these traumas generation after generation.
Native reservations in Canada or the US, suicides, overdoses, they've been happening in epidemic proportions for decades. We just don't think that's so important. Not that it's happening to us or the people that we care about. Now it's a crisis. And then if you ask the question, well, why is it that the Aboriginal population has got this tremendous rate of addiction? And again, that's a very interesting question, because this whole idea that addiction is a genetic disease flies out the window when you look at the Aboriginal experience. Because the Aboriginals in North America had actually access to potentially addictive substances long before Caucasians came here. They had access to tobacco. They had access to alcohol in New Mexico. They had access to psychedelic substances like peyote. And they even knew these substances, and they even used them. But how did they use them? They used them ceremonially, not to uptund and diminish their consciousness, but to raise their consciousness.
Exactly. And I would have to say that that's always been one part of my addiction. Um, Maybe it seems counterintuitive, at least with alcohol, but trying to achieve some next level of consciousness, um, and feel connectedness to the universe, which I did.
They used it to connect spiritually with creation. They used it to create community and contact and culture. The addictive use is just the opposite. The addictive use is to escape from pain, and it's alone and it's not communal. If the problem was genetic, why weren't they addicted before? The reason they're addicted now is because the severe trauma that they've suffered over hundreds of years. They're near extermination, and I don't have to give you all the details, I'm sure you know it all. Same thing in Canada. So what I'm saying about addiction, in short, is that every case of addiction originates in trauma.
Boom. And there he said it. Um, Addiction is based in trauma. More specifically, I would say unresolved, unhealed trauma.
And that trauma could be overt, like in the case of the Aboriginal population. Their children in Canada being taken away from them, sent to residential schools for 100 years, where they were sexually abused and beaten up, and their culture and their language was denied. In British Columbia, in 1960, I know a woman who was 4 years old in 1965 in my province of British Columbia, who at 4 years old was taken to the residential school where she spoke her tribal language, and the punishment was that they stuck a pin in her tongue for a whole hour, a 4-year-old. And then she sits there for a whole hour and she can't put her tongue in her mouth because it'll cut her lips. And then the sexual abuse began. So then when I look at Vancouver's downtown east side, which is North America's most concentrated area of drug use, we have more drug addicts there in a few square block radius than anywhere on the continent. It's a shock to people even who come from Detroit and New York to Vancouver. 30% of our clients down there are First Nations, are Aboriginal people. They make up 4% of the population. Why? Because of the severe trauma that they've experienced.
Right.
And that's huge. That's huge. And we can probably see those things reflected in prisons. I think we do. We see, disproportionate representation of non-white people, especially with, in relation to the overall percentage of a population that they make up.
And this is the one piece, the trauma piece that you and I are so aware of, but that addiction. I was talking to a colleague of mine, Jamie. Where are you, Jamie? You're here somewhere in the room? She's a physician from Detroit.
Oh, Dr. Jamie Hope, you in the room? Oh, I think she's in the Genius Lounge.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so she works in the emergency ward at a Detroit hospital. And she graduated in '05 from medical school in Michigan. And I asked her, how many lectures on emotional trauma did you receive? Not a single one. How many lectures on how the human brain develops in interaction with the environment did you receive? Not one. Yeah. Which is the same with me when I went to medical school, I don't know, 40-odd years ago. And so what I'm saying is that the medical world utterly misunderstands the problem and don't get any training in understanding human psychology. And the same thing is true of many of the programs where people go for addiction. So they never deal with the core issue. They only deal.
I learned this too, that's also true when it comes to studying and discussing menopause in medical school. I've heard doctors say that it's like a day out of their however long they are in medical school. It's very, very insignificant. And knowing this, for me, that's kind of why it's more motivation for me to enter this field, because I think he's 100% right. I think the source of all addictions are trauma. And again, like I said earlier, it's, it could be childhood trauma. It could be something that you don't even necessarily think of as trauma. Because maybe you should have been tougher, or you shouldn't have run away, or you shouldn't have skipped school, or you should have done your homework, or you should have taken out the trash sooner. It can be really simple, and it can be really complex. Obviously, as in the case of Joe Polish here, talking about his traumas.
With the behavior of addiction, but the behavior is only a symptom.
Yeah. Well, I want to touch on ADD because
Right.
I have been diagnosed with ADD. You have.
Yeah.
How many people in the room would admit or think they have ADD, right? And I've heard you talk about in your book, Scattered, that ADD is a response to trauma.
Yes, it is.
What does that mean?
Well, first of all, let me make a point that occurred to me when you were talking about your marijuana use and your cocaine use. Those are typical self-medications for ADD. Because the marijuana calms down the hyperactive mind. And if you get treated for ADD, what do they give you? They give you a stimulant, which elevates dopamine levels in the brain. Well, what do you think cocaine is? It's a stimulant. It elevates dopamine levels. So the point I'm making is that a lot of addictions are actually self-medications for specific conditions, right? Like in your case. Now, ADD. Again, the medical mantra around ADD, and I was diagnosed in my 50s, and two of my children were diagnosed afterwards. The medical mantra is that it's a genetic brain disease. Well, it isn't genetic, and it's not a brain disease. When you look at the tuning out, the absent-mindedness of ADD, why do we have that capacity to tune out, do you think? Nature gives us that capacity. We all have that capacity to dissociate, to tune out. Why?
I was just about to say that's dissociation. I have a huge problem with that. I am because I'm aware of it, I'm able to combat it relatively well. It doesn't mean I don't slip off for, I don't slip off for like more than a minute now, whereas, I could be gone for a long time. And yeah, being aware of it means I'm constantly having to be like, oh, you're thinking about something else. You're somewhere else. Come back. Stay in the present.
Well, it's very simple. If I were to threaten you right now, stress you, abuse you verbally, you would, the number of options available to you. One would be to get up and leave, which is called flight. Or you could stand up and assert yourself and tell me to stop, which is called fight. And if you couldn't do either, given that, how many hundreds of people are here?
There's about 400 between both rooms.
Okay, so there's 400 people here. You could ask for help. Those would be the functional options. But what if you couldn't escape because you're too small and powerless? What if you couldn't fight back for the same reason? And what if there's nobody to ask for help? Then what would you do? Well, you wouldn't do anything. Your brain would go into an automatic dissociative mode to protect you from the distress. So that's what it is. It's an adaptation to overwhelming stress. Now, if you put me back into my first year of life, and there are times in the first year of life when every second, like in this space of time, and millions of connections are being made in the brain. What's happening in my first year of life? My mother is stressed. The day after the German army marches into Budapest, when I am 2 months of age, she calls the pediatrician to say, would you please come and see Gabor, because he's crying all the time. And the pediatrician says, well, of course I'll come and see him, but I should tell you, all my Jewish babies are crying. Now, why are Jewish babies crying? Well, not because I know anything about Hitler or genocide, but because I'm picking up on my mother's stress. And there's a quote here from one of my teachers that I'd like to read to you, if I can find it.
I just want to throw in there really quickly that I'm a parent, and I was probably stressed. I definitely was stressed all the time, and not with the kids, but it makes you think, like, again, if you're a parent, like, oh crap, how much did I stunt my child's development and this healthy growth for them? And
And it says that the child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother or of anyone else he's with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. So let's say, what do I do then when my mother is depressed and stressed and terrorized? How do I deal with it? Can I fight back, escape, and ask for help from whom? I tune out. But then the tuning out becomes programmed into my brain. And then 55 years later, or 50 years later, I'm diagnosed with ADHD or ADD. Now, what I'm saying is that and I wasn't abused. Nobody abused me. I just had a depressed and fearful mother. And being a very sensitive, and the more sensitive you are, the more you pick up on that. So in those ADD, and if you look at it, it's an adaptation. It begins as an adaptation, which later on becomes a problem. So I'm not saying it's great, I'm saying that it begins as an adaptation, which then becomes a problem. That's the nature. These early adaptations, which children employ, not consciously, to protect themselves from stress, actually become problems later on. Now, if you look at the question of why between 2002 and 2013, I'm being approximate here, the rate of ADD diagnosis in American kids has gone up threefold. What's going on? What's going on is that the parenting environment has become increasingly stressed for all kinds of reasons. And when the parenting environment is stressed, the kids are stressed. And how do they cope with it? They tune out when the brains are developing. Now they're getting diagnosed and medicated and all this mental health crisis. And what we're not looking at is what is it about the environment that actually fosters or foments that response in children. And I'm only talking about ADD. We could talk about anxiety. Right. Because people who are addicted often self-medicate anxiety. They self-medicate it with work, with sex, with TV, with distractions, and of course with drugs. And the New York Times Magazine 2 weeks ago had an article about the burgeoning rate of anxiety in American teenagers, and apparently a third now of teenagers and adults in the United States suffer from anxiety. And why? Well, if it was genetic, it wouldn't be increasing, because genes don't change in a population over 10 years or 20 years or even 100 years. What's happening is that the conditions in which children are growing up is getting more and more stressful, and that has to do with the stress on the parents. And that also has to do, of course, with the workaholism of the parents, like in my case. You know, the world thought I was great. I was out there delivering babies and helping the dying, palliative care, and everything else in between. But what of me did my children receive? Not very much, because I was always trying to validate myself out there in the world. So then I pass on my trauma to them. But I pass it on not genetically, but through the conditions that obtained in my home and my kids were small.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying this video, and I want to let you know that I've got a book. They have symptoms that, because addicts or in active addiction, people lie, they cheat, they steal, they have symptoms that are much different than, say, like an actual disease, like cancer. And so they cause trouble, they cause a ruckus, they're self-destructive. How does one, how do you interact with someone that's caused so much grief in your life? I mean, in my worst stages of addiction, I was a pain in the ass. And so how does one hold compassion when there's a family member, a husband, a wife, a child, friends that are just causing so much trouble? How do we take that framing? Because I'd love to have people leave here and have a whole different perspective on how to interact with addicts, how to think about it, because through this room, we can make an incredible impact in the field of helping people with struggling with trauma.
Well, and just as you, in my case, when I was in my addictive phase, and my addiction was, besides to work, it was for shopping. And I shopped compulsively for classical music. And how can that be addiction? You just love music. No, I didn't. I love the music, yes, I'm passionate about it, but it's the shopping I was addicted to. I had to get more and more and more, and it doesn't matter how many CDs I bought, next day I had to get a whole bunch more.
Mm-hmm. Shopping used to be one of my addictions. I would impulse buy and immediately regret it. Like, I think for a long time, every single thing I ever bought, I was like, damn, why did I buy this?
And of course, in the process, I was spending a lot of money. And of course, the one addiction justified the other, because I was saying, I worked so hard, I deserve to give myself some pleasure. That's how clever the addicted brain is. It justifies everything. And I lied to my wife about where I was going, to the store again. But it was like I was like having an affair. I lied and I cheated and so on. So what do I say to families? So there's two major things I say to families. One is, you have a decision to make. There's two rational choices and one irrational one. The rational choice is, number one, what you're doing causes me so much pain, it's so much stress, I can't be with it. I love you very much, but this is too hard on me, and I'm not willing to expend my energies trying to self-care for all the stress that's being caused for me by your behavior, so I can't be with you. That's a perfectly rational choice. Or you can say, I love you very much, and I understand that what you're doing, whatever it is, comes out of your pain, and this is the only way so far you've found to deal with your pain. So I'm not going to judge you, I'm not going to cajole you, I'm not going to try and change you. I just hope you come to your senses at some point, but I'll be with you and I'll be supporting you emotionally and so on. That's another rational choice. What is completely irrational and dysfunctional is to stay with somebody and try and change them. To cajole them, to convince them, to bribe them, to beg them, to coerce them to change. That's what's crazy making. Don't ever do that. It's one or the other. That's the first thing. The second thing is, given my understanding of addiction, that it isn't an individual brain disease, but actually is a function of a child's experience, a person's experience in a family environment, and particularly in a multi-generational family environment, where trauma is passed on from one generation to the next, unwittingly, but it is.
Unwittingly, but it is. Yeah, I think so many people want to point to, oh, you get that from your dad, you get that from your mom's side of the family, your dad's side of the family. And, you know, people talk about it being genetic, but no, it's literally like I was abused as a child in certain ways. And when I'm when I became a parent, right? I'm not saying it would, someone who is abused as a child could become a parent who abuses inadvertently, right? Still reacting to that old trauma, um, running from the fucking pain.
I did not mean to traumatize my kids, but I did.
Right? Okay. He said it. Yeah, I'll say it. You know, my kids have been traumatized, um, and it sucks to know. But at least I know now what when I was acting that way. I fully understand it, and um, when I was able to do that, I was able to let it go. Not just like all of my trauma, not like, yeah, just let that go. And all of a sudden, I'm not as hurt, I'm not walking around as hurt anymore.
And parents do. Then we recognize that the addiction that's manifested in you didn't begin with you. It's actually an expression of multi-generational family dynamics. And so what it actually is that recognition allows for an opportunity now. Let's all heal together. So that's
Exactly. Let's all heal together. I mean, so important. You have to get safe a lot of times, which requires physically leaving. Um, and it's not always something you can do at the drop of a hat. Sometimes you have to plan. You have to plan. Maybe even a couple of years in advance. And I'm going to let him go on, but definitely, if you're in that type of situation, do what you can to get yourself and any children safe. And then I think the answer to this question is different for every situation, but you have to protect yourself and the ones who you are in charge of and care for.
People often think that the trauma was the rape. It wasn't. How old were you when, I'm not saying it wasn't traumatic, but how old were you when it happened to you?
That I can remember started around 8.
Okay, and how long did it go on for?
A couple years.
Who did you speak to about it?
No one.
That was the trauma. Yeah. If you had an 8-year-old child and somebody even looked at him the wrong way, just once, who would you want him to talk to if you're the father? You.
Yeah.
If your 8-year-old child had such a horrific experience and he didn't talk to you, how would you explain that to yourself?
I don't know.
Well, you weren't available for them.
Yeah.
And they already knew that you weren't available for them. So that original trauma was the loss of the parenting contact. Because I have to guess that your parents were traumatized and they just weren't emotionally there for you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean,
so this is where you sustain the trauma. So the rape then comes along as a secondary trauma. The first trauma was the loss of protection and connection and safety in the world. Now, in terms of how you interact with them in the present, that depends precisely on where you're at. If you haven't dealt with it yet, if you haven't healed, if you haven't recovered, if you haven't reconnected with it yourself, then whatever comes up is legitimate. If you're angry with them, if you hate them, that's legitimate. Why wouldn't you? If you don't want to see them and stay away from them, that's legitimate.
That's right. It is legitimate.
And in fact, at any time, whatever you decide is legitimate.
Yes.
However, what you'll find is that the more you heal, the more comfortable you get with yourself, the less of a psychological threat they become to you, because you're whole and okay in yourself. They're not going to dysregulate you. They're going to make you feel bad about yourself just because they show up. And you might even, and I'm not saying that you should, but you might even find yourself getting to a point of compassion for them. Yeah. And I've seen that happen as well. When the recovery is so complete that the person can actually have compassion because the perpetrator, I assure you, was another traumatized person.
In my case, absolutely, yeah.
And that's it's extremely important to note. And it's why things like narcissism run in families. It's because you have this abused person going around abusing people, and it sucks. It sucks, and I think that's why, my focus once I'm in the field will be to work with adults, to heal adults. Because the sooner we can do that, the quicker we can really start to break what a lot of people call generational curses, right? Which are probably nothing more than what we put on the next generation from ourselves.
I've worked through a lot with this individual, and I do have a lot of compassion because I know what happened to them. Same thing happened to them.
Right.
And it's sad in a lot of ways. I'm asking the question, I'm doing, thankfully, better in my life with my recovery than I ever have. It still is hard at times. It's still very hard.
Yes.
Yeah, it is hard. Even if you've done some healing. It is hard.
I know there's people in this room, though, that are just fucking livid and just outraged. And
that's perfectly legitimate, isn't it? That's the anger of the helpless child, and that's the anger that they turned against themselves all their lives. Yeah. And one of the ways you do that is through the addiction. You know, and the depression. I mean, what is depression? If you look at, this is interesting again, somebody talked about words. What does it mean to depress something? It means to push it down. When a kid experiences anger, but they can't express it, because to express it is too dangerous, then they push it down. Yeah. Then they become depressed. So that anger then turns against the self. So if the anger is coming out of them, that's great. But I hope they get some help with it so they can channel it in a healthy way. Rather than, because you just keep exploding in rage, actually puts you at risk of a heart attack and a stroke. So you might as well take that healthy anger or that rage even, and find some channels for it and deal with it.
Yeah, gotcha.
But there's no reason not to be angry at the perpetrator. If that's there, that's nothing more than natural.
We're so much as a society in the infancy stages of even beginning to really understand this as a whole. I mean, if you controlled everything, how would you treat this?
Well, take a very tragically well-known case right now, Harvey Weinstein, who clearly had an addiction to sexual predation. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's all kinds of justified outrage at the system that allowed him that enabled him to carry on for so many decades. And people are angry with him, which is totally understandable. But if he came to me for treatment, I would not begin with any kind of a judgment that what you did was bad. He already knows it. I would ask him, like I asked you guys, what did it do for you? What did you get from it that was missing from your life? And what was missing from your life, how did you lose it? What happened to you? In other words, whatever else you do, first of all, you have to accept these people as they are and not judge them, and understand that they were slaves to something inside them. And they didn't willingly make themselves slaves. Number one. Number two, something happened to create that compulsion. And that something that happened that created the compulsion was rooted in pain. And so in other words, you have to treat them with compassion, and you have to actually get to the core trauma, rather than just dealing with the behavior. And the problem with all the many programs, Betty Ford and elsewhere, people go for all these high-end, expensive treatments, rarely do they deal with the trauma. And even in the 12-step programs, they rarely deal with the trauma.
I would just say for the record that I am not a fan of 12-step programs. I don't recommend them to anyone unless it's something you're already familiar with and think you've had some success there. I would say, yeah, go to that. I would also encourage you to, get in line for therapy. Some places have, for like one-on-one therapy, you could be 3 to 12 months away from being able to get an appointment. So yeah, in that instance, if it's going to help you stay sober for a little bit, definitely go for it. But again, he's so on point here. I was fortunate that the treatment that I went to in 2022 and 2023 was, there was a trauma focus. It was, I can't remember, it's a certain system they have for mental health, basically like encapsulates spirituality, body, mind, all of that, and treats from that place. Yeah, I don't recommend it to anyone. And again, it's not really proven to actually work. long term. It's more like Amway. Yeah, like everybody knows that guy who's been or who picks up their 20 or 30 or 100-year coin or whatever, right? But like it's like Amway, it's just there's like one of those, like the rest of everybody else, like we keep falling off and getting back on, and it's because we're not treating our trauma.
That's David Smith, who's a physician in San Francisco, who founded the Haight-Ashbury Clinic back in the 60s. He said to me once that the medical profession is traumaphobic. So is the whole of society. We're surrounded by trauma and the manifestations of trauma, which show up in the culture, from politics to every other field, and yet we don't talk about trauma.
Right.
And I think this is one place women have an advantage over men, right? Largely, relationships between men are very, very surface level. I think, in a lot of cases, for a man to talk personally and deeply to another man, I mean, they probably have to either be like lifelong friends or, just super solid friends, not just regular friends. I have been kicked out of groups for being too in touch and willing to discuss personal things. I've been kicked out. And, it's whatever. It happens. And that's why I do this work, to change that.
Right. So treating the trauma is how you would...
Dealing with the trauma, yeah.
Yeah.
I want to distinguish two kinds of trauma. So there's overt trauma, then there's what we call developmental trauma. And we have two very great examples of it in the United States. So what does trauma do? It separates us from ourselves. We lose ourselves, like we said. It also gives us a very negative view of the world. So if we have a negative view of the world, then we act accordingly. We are defensive, and we're grandiose, and we're aggressive. So there's a man who said that the world is a horrible place. Now, I'm not commenting on anybody's politics here. I'm talking pure psychology. Okay? I'm not talking about policy, foreign or domestic. I'm talking about mind states. Please understand that. So however you voted in this last election, don't take offense, please. But the man who said that the world is a horrible place is the President of the United States. That's the world he lives in. And why does he live in that world? Because he grew up in a family that taught him that. His father was a domineering, rageaholic, a tyrant who demeaned his children. His brother drank himself to death. And this man develops all...
Just for the record, I was just looking up the date because I'm not a Biden fan, but I don't recall Biden ever saying that. And I was thinking Trump. And so, yes, this was recorded a month after January 6th, basically. And yeah, there you go.
Issues like attention problems and grandiosity, and psychiatrists have diagnosed them with narcissism and all this kind of stuff, which are not false. They're the outcomes of trauma. So there's that overt trauma. And we live in such a traumatized society that these people actually rise to the top. But his opponent was even more interesting. I don't know if you saw the Democratic National Convention. And when Hillary won the nomination, there was a video narrated about her life by God himself, Morgan Freeman. Now, how many of you saw that video about her life? Now, there was something very interesting in that video that I saw no comments on whatsoever. This anecdote comes from Hillary, and what happens is that, and it's presented as an example of wonderful character building, strength building, parenting. What happens is that the 4-year-old Hillary runs into her home to her mother.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I love this story, and I guess I'll let him get through it before I speak on it.
Afraid because neighborhood kids are bullying her, threatening her.
go back just a second.
What happens is that the 4-year-old Hillary, what happens is that, and it's presented as an example of wonderful character building.
Right. Okay. So Hillary's given a speech, and she's presenting this moment as character building and wonderful and seminal in her childhood. And let's just keep going.
Strength building parenting. What happens is that the 4-year-old Hillary runs into her home to her mother, afraid because neighborhood kids are bullying her, threatening her. And the mother says, there is no room for cowards in this house. Now you get out there and you deal with it. And this is presented as, this made me tough, and this made me a fighter, and this is character building. Now, the actual message to the child is not that there's no room for cowards in this house, because the 4-year-old or 5-year-old who runs to mom is only doing what any mammal will do, any young mammal will do when they're threatened, is they'll go to their protective figures. It's not cowardice, it's just natural attachment. The message is, there's no room for your vulnerability in this house. You have to be tough. You have to suck it up. Now, jump 65 years ahead, and the presidential campaign, and there's a famous scene where Trump is looming all over, hovering all over Hillary, and she doesn't say a thing. She's just sucking it up. And then she develops pneumonia. Remember during the campaign she had pneumonia? How did the world find out that she had pneumonia? Because she collapsed, and her security people had to pick her up. But she.
So I think probably went a little bit too far, but I hear stories like this from people in my life, and so many of them who are my age and older will tell stories like this and be like, yes, this was foundational, this helped me grow. And like, I think I've said it twice during the stream now, whether you realize it or not, there may be traumas. And exactly like he's saying, you weren't being told how to be strong. You were being told that I won't help you, that your parent, they won't help you. That's what you're being told.
Telling me about it. She didn't talk about it because she learned at an early age to suck it up, and she mustn't be vulnerable.
Okay, and now let's just go back to what I was saying about men being unable to be emotionally vulnerable with other men. And that's because more than women, we were taught from the very beginning to suck it up. Boys don't cry, blah, 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 blah. That's what we were told. And I tried not to teach my children that. I tried to make sure that my children could come talk to me. Was I always successful? I don't know. Did they always come talk to me? No. But they at least would talk to my ex-wife. So there was always one of us that they could talk to at any time and feel supported.
So what I'm saying, and that's what's called developmental trauma, where not when something bad happens to you, but when the good things that should happen don't happen. And the good thing that didn't happen is the mother should have scooped her up and said, "Oh boy, you're really scared, aren't you?" That's what didn't happen. And so what I'm saying is that there's that overt trauma, and there's lots of studies on how overt trauma, if those of you are not familiar with the adverse childhood experiences studies, the AC studies, where they looked at 17,000 Californians, half of them university graduates, and the more adversity there was in their childhood, meaning physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, death of a parent, a divorce, parent being addicted, a parent being mentally ill, violence in the family, neglect, a parent being jailed. For each of these adverse experiences, the risk of addiction goes up exponentially. And you can download your ACE score just by going to the internet. It'll give you a lot of insight about yourself. But there's that other kind of trauma, which is the developmental trauma, which doesn't happen because bad things happen to you, but just because you weren't held in the way you needed to be held. So that's the final thing I wanted to tell you.
Okay, I hope you found that video awesome.
All right. That's it. I really love this guy. Again, a hero of mine. I hope that I do get the opportunity to meet him one day, in all honesty. I would love to see this channel blow up enough and fast enough for him to be willing to come on here. But yeah, that's all I have for tonight. Thank you for coming to my first stream. You should be able to watch this on YouTube forever and ever. So, with that being said, again, first stream, I loved it. I was way more nervous than I needed to be. And I am wishing everyone a blessed night. Love yourself. Love yourself. Love yourself first. Really love. And yeah, I will see you guys again soon. Bye.